Snow falls on a piano that shouldn't be playing. A crowd freezes mid-laugh, glasses hovering, breath caught somewhere between a toast and a gasp, because the melody, rising from a stranger's hands, is impossible. No one alive should know it. It was buried 16 years ago with a boy who never got to finish it, a secret sealed in 8 bars and 1 broken promise. A woman grips a railing until her knuckles go white, chasing a ghost she thought she'd already grieved. Somewhere in this glass tower, a scarred hand still remembers what it cost to play. Somewhere else, a folder sits locked in a fireproof box, waiting 13 years for someone brave enough to open it. Tonight, a lie that built an empire starts to crack, and the man everyone overlooked is about to become impossible to ignore. The alarm went off at 4:45, the way it did every weekday, and Joseph Davis was already awake. Before it finished its second cycle, lying still in the dark, listening to the radiator work through its usual complaints, before it settled into something like warmth. He'd learned a long time ago that the first 20 minutes of any day belonged entirely to him. Before Amanda woke, before the building needed him, before he had to be anyone's version of Joseph Davis except his own. He used them mostly for silence, some mornings for the crossword, never, not once in 13 years, for a piano, though the habit of his hands still moved sometimes without asking permission, fingers drumming a rhythm against his knee that he never let himself follow all the way to a melody. He made coffee in the same chipped mug he'd owned since Amanda was in elementary school, packed her a sandwich out of habit even though she'd told him a dozen times she was old enough to make her own, and left it on the counter anyway, because some things about being a father didn't stop just because the child in question had grown taller than he expected and sharper than he'd hoped for. By 6 he was at Meridian Tower, badge scanned, uniform pressed the way it always was, moving through service corridors that ran beneath the building like a second, invisible city. He knew every maintenance worker on the day shift by name, and most of them knew him the same way, not as the quiet one, not as a mystery, just as Joseph, the guy who fixed the elevator on 3 faster than anyone they'd ever had, and never made you feel small for asking a question twice. Ruben Castillo, who ran the boiler room, called him Professor sometimes, a joke that had started years earlier when Joseph corrected a piece of wiring diagram nobody else on the crew could read and had never quite gone away. Ruben didn't know why the nickname fit so well. Joseph had never told him. That morning, prepping for the evening's gala, Ruben found him checking the tension on the old Steinway's legs where a caterer had backed a cart into it the week before. "They're gonna uncover that thing tonight." Ruben nodded toward the piano, wiping his hands on a rag. "Every year, some junior associate plays chopsticks on it and everybody claps like it's Carnegie Hall. It's a nice piano. You know how to play?" Joseph kept his eyes on the leg brace, tightening a screw that didn't need tightening. "A little. Man, I've known you 9 years. Didn't know that. Not much reason to bring it up." Ruben studied him a second, the particular look of a man who suspects there's more to a story, but knows better than to push a coworker who's never once pushed him. "Well, if they ask you to play tonight, do it. Be nice to see somebody from our floor up there instead of some kid from accounting." Joseph didn't answer that. He finished the brace, packed his tools, and told himself, the way he'd told himself 100 times before, that nobody was going to ask him to play anything. Not tonight, not any night, and the promise he'd carried since he was 20 would stay exactly where he'd kept it for 13 years, quiet, undisturbed, filed away with everything else. He'd decided the world didn't need to know. He was wrong about that. By 8 o'clock that evening, though not in a way he could have predicted, and the wrongness of it would follow him for the rest of the winter. The snow started at 6, and by 8 it owned the city, and Meridian Tower rose out of it like something that refused to notice weather at all. 52 floors of glass caught the streetlights and threw them back gold. Inside, the lobby had been turned inside out for the night. White light strung floor to ceiling. A blue spruce, taller than any 2 men standing on each other's shoulders. the smell of cinnamon fighting the smell of money and losing. Champagne glasses clinked somewhere near the elevators. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. Everyone here belonged to this building the way tenants belong, the way names on a lease belong. Except one man. Joseph moved through the crowd without disturbing it. 36 years old, gray uniform shirt washed thin at the collar, a laminated badge clipped crooked to his chest. He kept to the edges. Ballrooms had edges even when they didn't look like they did. And Joseph had spent more than a decade learning exactly where they were. He wasn't invisible. He was worse than invisible. He was seen and then immediately filed away, the way people file away a chair or a potted plant. Someone's decoration, someone's furniture, he didn't mind it most nights. Tonight he minded it a little more, because tonight his daughter was here. And daughters notice things fathers have trained themselves not to. Amanda Davis stood near the dessert table, in a coat 2 winters old, 19 years old, and doing the math on whether she could afford to smile at the chocolate fountain, without someone deciding she didn't belong near it. She'd come straight from her last final of the semester, backpack still slung over one shoulder, hair still damp from the walk. Community college let out early for the holidays. Joseph's shift didn't, so she'd waited 2 hours in the break room, reading a chemistry textbook, until he could steal 10 minutes. And now here they were, standing in a lobby that cost more to decorate than either of them made in a year. That was the arithmetic of Joseph's whole life now. Not bitterness, just arithmetic. You don't have to stand guard over me, Amanda said, arms crossed, watching the room instead of him. I'm not. You are. You've got your maintenance stance on. There's no such thing as a maintenance stance. There absolutely is. A small, tired smile, shoulders back, chin down, like you're bracing for someone to hand you a mop. Joseph almost laughed. He'd gotten good at almost. How was the final, he asked, mostly to change the subject. Long. I think I aced the second half and completely butchered the first. So it evens out to a B- if the professor's feeling generous. She reached for a strawberry off the dessert table, then thought better of it, hand dropping back to her side. You don't have to keep looking at me like I'm about to break something. I'm not looking at you like anything. You are. It's the same look you give a load-bearing wall before you cut into it. This time he did laugh, quiet, quick, gone almost as soon as it arrived, but real. Amanda counted those laughs, the way other kids counted birthday candles. Careful, a little proud of herself whenever she managed to earn one. Across the room, on the mezzanine that overlooked the whole glittering circus below, Elizabeth Jones stood with a flute of champagne she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. 34 years old, CEO of a company her father built and then nearly ruined, dressed in red because red didn't apologize for taking up space. She watched her own party the way a general watches a battlefield she already knows she's going to lose something on. Somewhere. She just didn't know where yet. She wasn't thinking about Jonathan tonight. She'd trained herself over 16 years not to think about Jonathan on any night that required her to function, which was most nights. She thought instead about the merger paperwork sitting unfinished in her office, about her father's calls that morning reminding her, twice, that appearances mattered more this quarter than any other, about Ryan somewhere below in the crowd, working the room the way he worked every room, like a man collecting favors he intend to cash later. Not far from the piano, half turned away from the crowd, stood a woman in a gray wool coat, a guest of the security office, rather than the executive floor, holding a small paper cup of coffee she'd taken more out of habit than thirst. Deborah White had spent 22 years in structural safety compliance before this company folded her division, and she still knew half the maintenance staff by first name, because good engineers remember the people who keep buildings standing more than they remember the people who sign the checks. She'd come tonight only because Kenneth Lee had asked her, an old colleague's favor, a chance to see the tower decorated once a year the way it used to be back when she'd worked here full-time. She noticed Joseph Davis across the room the way you notice a scar you thought had faded. Something about the set of his shoulders, The way he moved like he was apologizing for the space he took up. She'd seen him once before, years earlier, in a different building entirely, though she doubted he'd remember her face anymore. Then he'd remember the report she'd written and watched disappear. She filed the thought away and told herself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It just wasn't time yet. Down below, Ryan Robinson cut through the crowd like a man who'd never once had to ask permission to be somewhere. Navy suit. Watch worth more than Joseph's car. Elizabeth's fiancé. A word that fit him about, as well as a borrowed coat. Steering toward the dessert table, because he'd noticed the small commotion before anyone else had. A girl's stumbling. A slick patch on marble where champagne had been spilled and not yet mopped. Amanda's foot went sideways, her ankle rolling hard, and she went down against the edge of the table, catching herself with one hand while pain shot white up through her leg. She didn't cry out. She'd learned that from her father too, the swallowing, the going quiet instead of loud. But her face went pale, and her breath caught, and Joseph was across the floor before anyone else had finished turning to look. He was on his knees beside her before Ryan even arrived. "Don't move it yet." His voice stayed low. The same voice he used at 2 a.m. when she was small and the radiator clanked too loud to sleep through. "Let me see." "It's fine, Amanda. Fine, okay. It's not fine." Ryan arrived with his jaw already tight like the inconvenience had personally targeted him. "Can you control this?" His hand cut toward the wet gleam on the floor, toward Amanda, toward the whole unscheduled interruption of his evening. "This is a corporate event, not a daycare." Joseph's hands didn't stop moving, steady against Amanda's ankle, checking for the wrong kind of give, but something in his jaw went hard as stone. "She's 19. She slipped. It happens. It happens because someone's not watching their kid." Ryan's eyes dragged over Joseph's uniform, over the badge, over the whole cheap architecture of him. "Your maintenance. There's a service entrance for a reason." Amanda's breath caught again. And this time it wasn't the ankle. Something old cracked open behind Joseph's ribs, quiet and older than tonight, by a lot more than a decade. The specific humiliation of being told, again, in front of someone he loved, exactly what he was allowed to be in a room like this one. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That wouldn't cost him the job he needed to keep his daughter in a warm apartment, which was when Elizabeth's voice arrived instead, quiet, and somehow louder than anything else in the room. "You don't have the authority to speak to my staff that way." The room noticed. Rooms like this always notice power shifting, the way a herd notices weather. Elizabeth came down the mezzanine stairs, without hurrying, because hurrying would have made it look like an emergency, and this, she'd already decided, was not an emergency. This was a correction. "Elizabeth." Ryan used the wrong tone, the tone men used when they thought a woman's anger was a phase to be waited out. "Apologize." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to both of them. Ryan's jaw worked. His face went the specific red of a man recalculating an audience. "I was just now." The pause stretched long enough to be its own small humiliation. And then he managed it, clipped and joyless, aimed more at the floor than at either Davis. "Apologies." Elizabeth turned to Joseph, and something in her expression softened before she could stop it. The careful way he held his daughter's ankle, the fury banked so tightly behind his eyes it barely showed. The fact that he hadn't raised his voice once, even when every muscle in him clearly wanted to. She'd built a career reading rooms for weakness, and this was the opposite of weakness, and it caught her off guard in a way she didn't have. "Time to examine. There's a first aid kit in the East office." Her voice dropped quieter now. "Take her. Take your time." Joseph nodded, throat too tight for words that would have sounded grateful, which he hated, because gratitude in front of Ryan Robinson felt like one more thing being taken from him. He carried more than walked Amanda to the office. Her arm slung over the office, her arm slung over his shoulder, her weight lighter than it should have been for someone who'd been feeding herself gas station sandwiches between classes to save money. Nora Bennett, one of the executive assistants who'd stayed late to help run the event, found them there a few minutes later with a proper ice pack and a paper plate of cookies she'd swiped from the kitchen staff without asking, setting both down on the desk with the easy kindness of someone who did that kind of thing. Often enough that it barely registered as generosity to her anymore. "You're the one from the mailroom," Amanda said, wincing as Joseph adjusted the wrap. "Executive floor, actually, but close enough some days." Nora smiled, crouching to check the ankle herself, with the practiced eye of someone who'd bandaged more scraped knees than her job description technically required. "You'll live. Ice it. Stay off it tonight, and eat these cookies before your dad decides they're not appropriate work behavior." "They're appropriate," Joseph said and meant it, more grateful than the words let on. By the time the ankle was wrapped and iced, and Amanda had stopped white-knuckling the armrest, 40 minutes had passed, the swelling already easing enough that she could rotate her foot in slow, careful circles without wincing at every pass. "You okay?" He crouched in front of her, checking the wrap one more time. "You're the one who looked like you wanted to put him through a window." "I didn't. You wanted to." Joseph exhaled, something almost like a laugh. Wanting to and doing it are different zip codes. Amanda studied him a second too long. "You used to not swallow things like that." He didn't answer that. There were versions of himself that existed only in stories she'd been told, not things she'd witnessed, and he preferred to keep it that way. The man in the stories had hands that hadn't yet been ruined. The man in the stories walked into rooms like this one and got applause instead of a service entrance joke. That man had been 23 years old and certain the world owed him something, and the world had responded by crushing his right hand between 1,100 pounds of falling steel rigging and teaching him, in one afternoon, exactly how wrong he'd been. Sometimes, late at night, he let himself remember the summer that came before all of it, the way you let yourself touch a bruise just to confirm it's still tender. A camp in the hills, 3 weeks of scholarship kids and trust fund kids, sharing the same cabins and pretending the difference didn't matter, and a girl with ice blue eyes who laughed at things other people found ordinary, who'd once sat next to him at a cafeteria table without knowing his name and asked what he was working on, genuinely curious, in a way that made him feel, for the length of one lunch period, like someone worth being curious about. He'd been 20 then, and so certain he'd never be brave enough to tell her so. And so he'd done the only thing he knew how to do instead. He'd built her something out of 8 borrowed bars and handed the finished thing to his more confident friend, the way a person hands a lit match to someone else, because their own fingers are too afraid to hold the flame. He shook the memory off the way he always did, folding it back into the drawer where he kept it, and helped his daughter to her feet. They came back out into the lobby just as someone, a junior associate, 2 drinks past, confident, had thrown open the lid of the old Steinway in the corner. It usually sat covered, more furniture than instrument. Decorative in the specific way expensive things become when nobody remembers what they were for. Tonight it stood open, and a small crowd had gathered, laughing, requesting songs the associate mostly couldn't play. A young woman near the tree had her phone raised, filming the little scene for no reason more serious than the way people film anything that looks festive enough to post. Amanda's eyes found the piano instantly. "Dad, no, you haven't even heard the question." "I know the question. One song." Her hand found his sleeve. "It's Christmas Eve, my ankle hurts. Humor your injured daughter. That's emotional blackmail. It's working though." Joseph looked at the piano the way a man looks at a door he spent years walking past on purpose. Something clenched behind his ribs again, uglier this time, closer to grief wearing fear's clothes. Every time he touched keys in front of people who might recognize what he used to be and see, more clearly, everything he'd become instead. But Amanda's eyes were doing the thing they did, the thing that had worked on him since she was small enough to fit in one arm, and it was Christmas Eve, and she'd taken a fall for him tonight, without complaining once, and Ruben's voice from that morning was still sitting somewhere in the back of his skull. "Be nice to see somebody from our floor up there instead of some kid from accounting, and maybe, just this once." He wanted that, too. He sat down at the bench like a man lowering himself into cold water. The room didn't quiet all at once. It quieted in pieces. First, the people closest, then a wider ring, curiosity doing what curiosity always does. Joseph's hands hovered above the keys, trembling just slightly, just enough that only Amanda would have noticed, and she pretended not to. The woman with the phone kept filming, unaware she was catching anything more than a nice moment for her weekend post. Then he began to play. It came out slow at first, almost hesitant, notes placed like a man testing ice. Then it built, not loud, never loud, but deep, the kind of melody that didn't ask for attention so much as it took the room's attention without permission, folding it into something aching and unbearably tender. His right hand moved across the keys, scarred palm catching the light, the old injury visible, but no longer in charge of him. Not tonight, not for these 4 minutes. He played with his eyes closed. He played like a man remembering something he'd sworn never to say out loud. On the mezzanine, Elizabeth had one hand on her coat, halfway to leaving. When the first notes reached her, she stopped. That was not the same as choosing to stop. Her body simply refused the next step. The way a body refuses a step at the top of a staircase it has forgotten is there. Her fingers found the brass railing and gripped it hard enough to hurt. She knew this song. There was no version of the universe in which she should know this song, and yet every note landed exactly where memory said it would. 16 years compressed into 4 minutes. A summer night at a music camp she hadn't let herself think about in longer than she could admit. A boy with dark, restless eyes playing this exact melody under a sky too full of stars to be believed. Jonathan had written this. He'd played it once, only for her, and told her it held everything he felt and couldn't say out loud. And then 3 weeks later, Jonathan was gone, and the song had gone with him, existing nowhere on earth except behind her own ribs, where she'd buried it so deep. She'd started to wonder, some years, whether she'd invented the whole memory to survive the loss of it. She hadn't invented it. It was real. It was happening. Right now, in a lobby full of strangers, coming out of a stranger's hands. Her breath went thin and fast. The kind of breathing that doesn't fill anything, that just moves air in shallow, useless pulls. Either she was losing her mind quietly at her own Christmas party, or someone in this building knew a secret that had died with the only other person who'd ever known it. Nearby, Deborah White had gone very still too, coffee forgotten in her hand, watching the scarred right hand move across the keys with a familiarity that made the back of her neck prickle. She didn't know the song. She knew the hand. She'd seen a version of that same hand 13 years earlier, wrapped in gauze on a gurney, while she stood outside a rehearsal hall answering questions from an investigator who never called her back. She said nothing to anyone that night. She only watched and filed the moment away with the rest of the things she'd spent a decade not saying out loud. Elizabeth came down the stairs on legs that didn't feel entirely like her own. Joseph finished, opened his eyes, and found her standing 3 feet away, pale, blue eyes bright with something unshed. The whole practiced composure of her stripped out to sow something raw and unguarded. Where did you learn that? It came out less like a question and more like a demand wearing a question's shape. It's an old melody. He stood slowly, heart hammering. Something I picked up a long time ago. Don't. Her voice cracked and she hated that it cracked. That song was written for me. By someone who's been dead for 16 years. No one else knew it. No recording exists. No sheet music exists. So I'm asking you again, where did you learn it? Joseph's jaw tightened. Every answer available to him led somewhere he'd spent 13 years avoiding. Ma'am, I should get my daughter home. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got tonight. Their eyes held, and something passed between them that neither could have named out loud. Recognition without evidence. The particular vertigo of meeting someone who is clearly carrying a piece of a story you thought only you owned. Kenneth Lee, the night security supervisor, 60 years old and built like a man who'd spent 4 decades being underestimated by people half his age, watched the whole exchange from his post by the elevators with the specific stillness of someone who already knew more than he was going to say. He'd worked this building 11 years. He'd known Joseph Davis for 9 of them. In 9 years, he had never once heard the man play a note, which told him something had shifted tonight that wasn't going to shift back. "Miss Jones," he stepped forward, easy, practiced, the tone of a man diffusing something before it became a headline. "It's late. Might want to let your guests get on with their evening." Elizabeth didn't look away from Joseph Kenneth. "Did you know about this?" "Know about what?" "That he plays." A pause, small, deliberate. "I know he fixes the elevator on 3 faster than anyone we've ever had. Rest is his business." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth, and all 3 of them knew it. Elizabeth exhaled, forced her shoulders down from around her ears, forced her voice back into something that resembled the woman who ran this building, instead of the 18-year-old girl who used to believe in things like fairy tales and forever. "Take care of your daughter." Her voice steadied quieter now. "We'll speak again." It wasn't a request. Joseph gathered Amanda's coat, helped her up despite her protests that she could manage, and got them both to the private elevator before either of them said a word. The doors closed. The music from the lobby faded into a low, distant hum. Amanda watched her father's reflection in the polished steel doors. "You want to tell me what that was?" "Not tonight." "Dad." Amanda, she studied him a long moment, the tight set of his shoulders, the way his scarred hand had curled into a loose fist at his side, like it was bracing for something. That woman looked like she saw a ghost. Joseph didn't answer. The truth was worse than a ghost. The truth was that Elizabeth Jones had just heard the sound of Paman, of a promise he'd made to a dead man 16 years ago, and there was no version of tonight where that promise survived contact with the woman it had been made about. The elevator dropped them at the parking garage level, and the cold outside hit like a correction. Joseph got Amanda settled in the passenger seat of his 10-year-old sedan, checked the ankle wrap one more time, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine for a full minute, staring out at nothing. "She's going to come looking for you." Not a question. "I know. And you're going to keep pretending you don't know why." "I don't know why for as long as I can manage it. That's usually how it works." Amanda studied her father's profile. The tired lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she was small, the specific exhaustion of a man who'd spent years making himself smaller so nothing else could be taken from him. "You played beautifully tonight." Her voice softened. "I've never actually heard you play like that." "Not once. Not really." Something moved behind Joseph's eyes, something that looked almost like fear wearing gratitude's clothes. "There's a reason for that." "Because of your hand?" "Because of a lot of things your hand doesn't explain." He finally turned the key, and the engine caught, and the heater began its slow, grinding effort against the cold. "Get some sleep tonight. We'll figure out the rest of it tomorrow." There was no figuring out the rest of it. Not the next morning, but not for either of them. Because at 6 the next morning, 2 hours before her scheduled office hours, Elizabeth Jones was already at her desk with a manila folder open in front of her. Joseph Davis's employment file, thin, sparse, exactly the file of a man who'd built his whole adult life around being unremarkable on paper. 3 years of employment, no college listed. Prior work, warehouse, grocery, odd jobs the file didn't bother detailing. Emergency contact, Amanda Davis, 19. Daughter, no wife listed. No prior address that connected to anything. Nothing in the file explained a man who could sit down at an untouched Steinway and produce, from memory, a piece of music that had died with its only known author 16 years ago. Elizabeth stared at the small, unremarkable photo clipped to the corner of the file, Joseph's badge picture, taken 3 years earlier. A man photographed the way people photograph a driver's license, giving the camera nothing. She picked up her phone. Her assistant answered on the second ring, voice still thick with sleep. "I need you to find someone." No preamble, the words coming faster than she'd planned them. "Stephen Scott. He used to teach at Belmont Conservatory. Track him down today. Tell him it's about Jonathan." A pause on the other end, careful. It's Christmas morning, Miss Jones. I'm aware what day it is. Elizabeth's eyes went back to the photo, to the flat, guarded face of a man who was, at this exact moment, somewhere across the city, still deciding how much longer he could keep his secret intact. Find him anyway. She hung up before her assistant could ask why. The truth was, Elizabeth herself didn't fully know why yet, only that something in her chest had cracked open the night before, in front of 100 witnesses, and she was no longer capable of pretending the crack wasn't there. 16 years of careful, deliberate distance from a memory she'd protected like a wound that had finally, mercifully, stopped bleeding, and one maintenance worker's hands on a piano had reopened it in 4 minutes flat. She thought of Ryan then, briefly, guiltily, the ring she still wore, out of habit, more than conviction. She thought of her father, and what he would say if he knew she'd spent Christmas morning obsessing over an employee. Instead of finalizing merger paperwork, she thought, mostly, of Jonathan's face, the one she kept in a drawer she rarely opened. Dark hair, restless eyes, a boy who'd promised her forever in 8 bars of music, and then broken that promise, the only way death ever lets anyone break a promise, without meaning to. Across the city, in an apartment, with a radiator that still clanked at night, Joseph Davis sat at the small kitchen table, long after Amanda had gone to bed, staring at his own scarred hand under the yellow kitchen light. He flexed it once, slowly, feeling the old tightness where the surgeons had done what they could and no more. 13 years, and it still ached on cold nights, a permanent reminder of every choice that had led him here. He thought about Elizabeth's face when she'd asked her question. Not anger, not even suspicion, but something closer to grief startled awake. He thought about the promise he'd made a dying friend's memory. A promise now older than his daughter by almost 3 years. A promise he'd kept by disappearing so thoroughly that even he sometimes forgot the man he used to be. That had been the whole point of disappearing. If no one knew who he'd been, no one could ask him why he wasn't that person anymore. Except now someone knew exactly enough to start asking. He thought about running. He was honest enough with himself, in the particular silence of a kitchen at 1 a.m, to admit that running had crossed his mind more than once tonight. A new city, a new name on a new employment application, the quiet, practiced art of vanishing that he'd already perfected once before. He could do it again. Amanda could transfer credits. They'd survived worse moves on shorter notice. But Amanda had looked at him tonight in a way she hadn't in years. Something like pride, something like wonder, watching her father become, for 4 unguarded minutes, a person she'd only ever heard about in half-finished sentences. Some old stubborn part of him didn't want to be the reason that look disappeared again. So he stayed at the table. He didn't decide anything that night, not really, except one thing. Whatever came next, he wasn't going to be the coward who ran a second time, which, he already suspected, sitting there in the cold kitchen light, with his ruined hand flat against the table, was going to cost him far more than the first time had. 3 days later, when Elizabeth finally sent someone to the maintenance department to formally run a meeting with employee Joseph Davis, the supervisor came back with an answer that made her go very still. Joseph Davis had not shown up for his last 2 scheduled shifts. His apartment, when a building representative was quietly dispatched to check on him, a courtesy visit they called it, though everyone involved understood it was something closer to reconnaissance, turned out to be empty. Rent paid through the end of the month. No forwarding address left with the landlord. A neighbor mentioned, vaguely, a moving truck 3 mornings ago, a man and his daughter, loading boxes, in the dark before most of the building was even awake. He was gone. Elizabeth stood in her office that evening, with the report in her hand. The city lights spread out below her window like something indifferent to the particular panic, rising in her throat. She'd done this. She knew she'd done this. Her questions, her intensity, the raw, unguarded need for answers. She hadn't been able to hide behind professional distance. She'd frightened him into vanishing, the same way she suspected watching the careful non-answers in his file. Someone or something had frightened him into vanishing at least once before. But why? What was a maintenance man protecting so carefully that disappearing was easier than answering one question about a song? Somewhere in this city, that man was still out there, and whatever secret he was protecting, Elizabeth understood. Standing alone in her glass office, with the whole glittering skyline, refusing to give her any answers, was somehow tangled up with the last few weeks of a life. She'd spent 16 years trying not to grieve properly. She wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. Stephen Scott answered his door on Christmas morning in a cardigan the color of old sheet music, silver hair uncombed, glasses fogged from the coffee in his hand. He'd taught piano for 31 years. He'd learned, in that time, to recognize the specific weight of a phone call that couldn't wait for a decent hour. Elizabeth arrived at 9, dressed like she hadn't slept, carrying a laptop instead of a gift, and Stephen understood immediately. This wasn't a courtesy visit. This was an exhumation. "I need you to watch something." She was already opening the laptop on his kitchen table before he'd finished offering her a chair. The video was shaky. Shot on someone's phone, from across a crowded lobby, 31 seconds of a stranger playing an untouched piano. Stephen watched it once in silence, then again. His coffee went cold in his hand and he didn't notice. Where did this come from? His voice had lost its Christmas morning softness entirely. A building employee. 3 nights ago, Elizabeth's hands were folded too tightly in her lap. "Stephen, is that Jonathan's song?" A long pause. The kind of pause that answers a question before the mouth catches up. "It's the melody, yes." He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man buying himself 5 extra seconds before a truth he'd been avoiding for 16 years. "But Elizabeth, there's something I should have told you back then. Something I thought would hurt you more than it would help." Her chest tightened around the words before she could stop them. "Just say it." Jonathan never finished that song. The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, a car alarm chirped twice and stopped. "That's not possible." She heard how thin her own voice sounded saying it. He wrote opening. 8 bars. Beautiful bars. He always had that gift, the way he could make 4 notes sound like confession. Stephen set his glasses down on the table, careful, deliberate, but he got stuck there. Frustrated, he'd play those 8 bars over and over and then just stop. Scrap it. He wanted it perfect for you, and perfect kept refusing to arrive. So who finished it? There was another boy at camp that summer. Quiet, talented in a way nobody bothered to notice, because Jonathan took up all the noticing in any room he walked into. Stephen exhaled slowly. Jonathan asked him for help. The boy took those 8 bars and built the rest around them, turned them into something none of us expected. When Jonathan died 3 weeks later, the song became his. Nobody corrected it. I told myself it would dishonor his memory to say otherwise. I've had 16 years to decide whether that was cowardice or kindness, and I still don't know which. Elizabeth's hands had gone cold in her lap. Who was he? The other boy. I remember him. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, not after that video. Stephen's voice steadied. Careful now. But I made him a promise, Elizabeth. A long time ago. And I don't break promises just because they've become inconvenient. This isn't inconvenient. Her voice cracked, sharper than she intended. This is my life. This is the only thing I have left of him. Stephen looked at her for a long moment, something aching and apologetic behind his eyes, then asked the man who played it. Ask him to release me from what I promised. Until he does, I won't be the one who breaks it for him. Which told her everything and nothing at once. Which meant Joseph Davis wasn't just a stranger with an impossible memory. Which meant he was the other boy. Which meant 16 years of grief had been sitting 3 floors below her office in a gray uniform, mopping elevators. And she'd walked past him 100 times without once looking closely enough to see it. She drove home, with the windows cracked despite the cold, needing the air, needing something to cut through the static in her skull. Joseph, meanwhile, had already made his decision 2 nights earlier, in that cold kitchen with his ruined hand flat on the table. He and Amanda were 300 miles away by the time Elizabeth finished her conversation with Stephen. A rented room above a hardware store, in a town too small to have its own zip code jokes. Boxes still taped shut in the corner, because unpacking felt like admitting they were staying. Amanda hated it on sight. She said so within the first hour. There's one grocery store. She stared out the window at a main street that closed at 6. One, and it's called Hank's. Hank's has character. Hank's has a taxidermied deer wearing a Santa hat in the window, Dad. That's the character I'm referring to. She turned from the window, arms crossed, 19 years old, and done pretending she didn't understand exactly what was happening. You didn't even talk to me about this. We just left. Middle of the night, like we were running from something. We were running from something. From a woman being nice to me about a chocolate fountain. Joseph's jaw tightened, the old familiar clench. It's more complicated than that. It's always more complicated than that. That's what you say every single time something happens, and then you never explain the complicated part. Amanda's voice rose. Not quite shouting, but close years of a father's careful silences, finally cracking something open in her too. I liked it there, Dad. I liked the cookies that nice assistant gave me. I liked watching you play. For the first time in my entire life. Like an actual person instead of a ghost who fixes elevators. And then you packed us into the car at 4 in the morning and now we're in a town with a Santa deer, and I don't even know what I'm supposed to be scared of. Joseph sat down heavily on a box that hadn't been unpacked, hands hanging between his knees. You're not supposed to be scared of anything. That's the whole point. Then, why do you look scared? He didn't have an answer for that. Not one he was ready to give her, anyway. Amanda studied him a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from anger into something gentler, more patient, the specific patience of a daughter who'd spent her whole life reading, a father who communicated mostly in silences. You always told me running from a problem just moves the problem somewhere new. You said that to me in 4th grade. When I wanted to switch schools instead of dealing with a girl who was mean to me. That's different, is it? He looked up at her, and for a moment the exhaustion in his face was so total, it aged him 10 years in a single expression. I made a promise a long time ago. To someone who isn't here to release me from it. And every time I get close to breaking that promise, some part of me panics and runs, because I don't know what's left of me once it's broken. Maybe there's more left than you think. Amanda crouched in front of him, hand on his knee, her voice steadier than her 19 years had any right to be. Maybe the promise was never supposed to last this long. Maybe it already did its job, and you're just scared to find out what happens next. Joseph stared at his daughter, this girl who'd grown up doing homework at a break room table, who'd never once complained about second-hand coats or gas station dinners, who somehow, despite everything, had turned out braver than he'd ever managed to be. When did you get so smart? I had a good teacher. He just forgets to take his own advice. The 2 days in that small town stretched longer than either of them expected. Amanda found a diner 3 doors down from Hank's that served coffee strong enough to strip paint and struck up an unlikely friendship with the waitress, a woman not much older than herself who was saving up for veterinary school 1 shift at a time. Joseph spent an afternoon fixing the landlord's broken porch step without being asked, the old habit of making himself useful wherever he landed, and found, to his mild surprise, that the work steadied something in him that sitting still never quite managed to. On the 2nd night, Amanda found him standing in front of the room's small upright piano, an old, out-of-tune thing the previous tenant had apparently left behind, his hand resting on the closed lid, without lifting it. You gonna play it? She asked from the doorway. Probably not tonight. You know you're allowed to want 2 things at once. Scared and wanting it anyway aren't opposites, Dad. I looked it up. Since when do you look things like that up? Since I started paying attention to my father, instead of just worrying about him. She crossed the room, sat on the narrow bed, watching him. You built her a whole song, and never told anyone it was yours. That's the loneliest thing I think I've ever heard. And I've heard you talk about your own father exactly twice in my whole life. Joseph's hand finally lifted off the piano lid, resting instead against his own chest, like he was checking something was still there. I didn't want you carrying it, whatever this turns into. I wanted you to have a normal life. I've never had a normal life, Dad. I had a good one instead. Those aren't the same thing, and I'd rather have the good one, even with the complicated parts. They drove back into the city 2 days later. Neither of them said much on the highway. The radio low, snow starting again somewhere past the county line. Joseph didn't call ahead. He didn't have a plan beyond the drive itself. He just knew, with the particular clarity that comes after running out of other options, that he was done being the man who vanished. He found Elizabeth exactly where some instinct told him she'd be. The lobby, late, alone, the Steinway sitting open and untouched under the tree lights, snow falling thick and silent outside the tall windows. She was standing near the piano with her coat half on, like she'd been circling the decision to leave for the better part of an hour and losing every time. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of his footsteps on marble, unhurried, deliberate. You came back. She didn't turn around. I shouldn't have run. His voice stayed low, rough at the edges. My daughter asked me why we left. I didn't have a good answer for her. She liked it here. Liked the cookies your assistant gave her. Liked the lights. He stopped a few feet away. I owed you the truth, even if you end up hating me for it. I could never hate you for playing beautifully. She turned, then, and her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, unguarded in a way he hadn't seen from her before. But I need to understand that song. Stephen told me everything, that Jonathan never finished it, that someone else did. Joseph's whole body went still. Was it you? The question landed like something physical between them. He looked at her for a long moment. Years of hiding, 16 years of silence, and all of it collapsed down into one small, unbearable moment in an empty lobby at midnight. Yes. The word came out simple, almost gentle. It was me. Elizabeth's hand found the edge of the piano, gripping it the way she had the night this all started, steadying herself against something that had just fundamentally rearranged. Why? Her voice barely held. Why would you let him take credit for it? Why would you disappear like that man never existed? Because he loved you first. Because he loved you loudly. The way people who are used to being seen know how to love. Out in the open, no fear of it. And I was nobody. A scholarship kid who washed dishes at a diner to afford bus fare to camp. I watched the way your face changed when he played for you. I thought that's what love was supposed to look like. Big, certain, not this. He gestured at himself, at the uniform, at everything he'd become. So you wrote a love song and gave it to another man to deliver. I wrote a love song for you. Something in his voice loosened, unsteady. Jonathan just carried it the last few feet. He knew how I felt. He wasn't cruel about it. He offered, more than once, to tell you the truth. I said no every time. I told him you deserved someone whole, someone certain, not someone who was going to spend his whole life being mistaken for furniture. Tears slid down Elizabeth's face, unchecked, unstoppable, and then he died. And then he died. His voice dropped lower, and I let his memory keep the song. Because it made you happy, and your happiness felt like the only thing I had any right to give you. And then I went home and spent the next several years trying very hard to forget I'd ever been anyone else. What happened to your hand? Her eyes dropped to it, the scarred right hand hanging loose at his side. Stephen said you were remarkable. Why are you here, fixing pipes, instead of somewhere on a stage? Joseph lifted the hand slowly, turned it so the light caught the old scarring, the raised lines where surgery had done what it could and stopped short of a miracle. 3 years after that summer, I signed a contract with an entertainment company. Meridian Live, a division your family's company used to run, before it folded into what Meridian Group is now. He watched something flicker across her face, recognition arriving a half-second before he confirmed it. Rigging failure during a rehearsal, cost-cutting on equipment that should have been replaced 2 seasons earlier. I pushed another performer clear, didn't quite manage to clear myself in time. Elizabeth's breath went shallow. My father ran that division. I know. Did you know that when you took the maintenance job here? Not at first. Joseph held her gaze, steady despite everything shaking loose in his chest. I needed work, any work. Then I saw the company name on a directory sign in the lobby, and I put it together slowly, over weeks. The way you put together something you don't actually want to be true. And then I saw you, and I knew for certain. A small, humorless breath. I stayed anyway. Because watching you from a distance felt better than not seeing you at all. That's the whole shameful truth of it. Before Elizabeth could find words for what that confession did to her, the lobby doors opened hard enough to rattle, cold air rushing in ahead of two men. Ryan Robinson first, face flushed with something between anger and vindication. Behind him, flanked by a pair of men in suits, who looked like they'd been paid specifically to look imposing, came Anthony Jones, 63 years old, silver hair combed back with the same precision he'd once run an entire company with, eyes landing on Joseph with instant, practiced contempt. So it's true, his voice carried easily across marble. My daughter's been sneaking around with the help. What are you doing here? Elizabeth stepped instinctively between her father and Joseph. Ryan called me. Said you were making a fool of yourself over some maintenance man trying to extort you with a sob story about an old accident. Anthony's mouth curled. I assume he means the Meridian Live incident. The one where this nobody tried to sue us for a fortune because he couldn't get out of the way of falling equipment fast enough. He wasn't trying to extort anyone. Elizabeth's voice snapped taut. And that accident wasn't his fault. It was ours. It was business. Anthony's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Decades of boardrooms had taught him volume was for people who hadn't yet learned control. Sometimes sacrifices happen for the bottom line. He was compensated. Barely enough to cover the surgeries. Her voice shook now, finally, all the careful composure of the last 16 years fracturing at once. You ruined his career and called it fair. He was mediocre at best. Anthony's gaze slid over Joseph with open disdain. If he'd had real talent, he'd have found a way through it. Instead, he's mopping floors, which is exactly where mediocrity ends up. Joseph didn't answer, didn't trust himself to. His scarred hand curled slowly into a fist at his side, the only outward sign of everything he was holding down. Ryan's voice cut in, sharper now, aimed at Elizabeth. This is exactly the problem. You're so busy playing house with the janitor that you've forgotten what's actually at stake here. Our wedding is in 6 weeks. That merger creates a company neither of our families can build alone. If word gets out you're involved with him, we lose the investors. We lose the board. We lose everything. Then let it be lost. Elizabeth's voice went cold, final. I don't love you, Ryan. I don't think I ever did. This engagement was my father's idea from the start, and I am done letting him arrange my life like a merger. Anthony's face went dark red. You ungrateful. No. Elizabeth cut him off, and the single syllable landed with the weight of 16 years, finally finding its voice. Let's talk instead about how you sacrificed every meaningful thing I could have had. Because none of it was profitable enough for you. Let's talk about how you taught me love was a liability. And let's talk about how you watched an innocent man's entire life fall apart, because saving money mattered more to you than doing the right thing. She turned to Ryan, chin lifted. The engagement is off. You'll have formal notice from my attorneys by morning. Ryan's face twisted, something ugly surfacing beneath the tailored suit. You'll regret this. I have documentation on irregularities in your last 3 acquisitions. I will make sure every financial desk in this city has it before the week is out. Try. Elizabeth stayed steady despite everything. But do it from somewhere else. You're no longer welcome in this building. Kenneth Lee appeared from the direction of the security desk almost before she finished the sentence, as though he'd been waiting for exactly this cue for longer than anyone realized, and escorted Ryan out into the snow with a firm hand and no words at all. Anthony lingered a moment longer, eyes hard as flint, voice dropping low enough that it almost sounded like concern instead of threat. You're making a mistake, Elizabeth. That man is a ghost, a failure. He will drag you down with him, maybe. Elizabeth's voice had gone quiet now, exhausted, the fight draining out of it, and leaving something more dangerous behind, certainty. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in a mirror when this is over. Can you say the same about what you did 13 years ago? Anthony didn't answer that. He turned and walked out into the snow, without another word, and the door swung shut behind him, with a sound that felt, in that lobby, like the end of something much larger than one conversation. The silence that followed stretched long, heavy, cut only by the soft mechanical hum of the building settling around them. Elizabeth sank onto the piano bench, all the adrenaline leaving her body at once, hands trembling now that there was no one left to perform composure for. Joseph sat down beside her, careful, giving her room to breathe before he spoke. I'm sorry for all of it landing on you tonight. Don't be. She wiped her face with the back of one hand, a small, unsteady laugh escaping despite everything. I've spent 16 years protecting a version of my life that wasn't even true. I think I needed it to collapse. That's a generous way to describe your father calling security on your ex-fiancé. He didn't call security. I did. A ghost of a smile. First decision I've made all night that didn't require anyone's approval but mine. Joseph looked down at his hands, the scarred one and the whole one, resting on his knees. I need you to understand something. I didn't come back tonight expecting any of this. I came back because my daughter told me running never actually solves anything. It just relocates the problem. I wasn't trying to blow up your engagement or expose your father. I just couldn't keep being the coward who vanished a second time. I know. Elizabeth turned to look at him fully, something steadier settling behind her eyes now, grief and fury, and something warmer all tangled together into a single, exhausted clarity. I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it instead of finding another door to disappear through. Okay, if I asked for a real chance to know you, actually know you, not the ghost of a boy from a summer camp, not the man in a uniform I walked past for 3 years without seeing, would you be brave enough to say yes? Even with my father circling like this isn't over, even with the press about to call you a con man and me a fool. Joseph looked at her for a long moment, something loosening across his shoulders for the first time in years. I wrote you a love song when I was 20 years old, and too scared to sign my own name to it. His voice found something steadier. I think I can manage a little more courage than that now. Elizabeth laughed, short and startled and real, tears still tracking down her face. Good, because I'm terrified. And I could use somebody who already knows what it costs to start over. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady and indifferent, burying the tracks Anthony and Ryan had left crossing the plaza toward their separate cars. Neither Elizabeth nor Joseph noticed the black sedan idling at the curb a moment longer than it should have. Ryan Robinson sitting behind the wheel, with his phone already in hand, thumb hovering over a contact labeled Simply Press, Financial Desk, jaw tight with the particular fury of a man who had just watched his last best chance at solvency walk out a set of glass doors behind him. Ryan's fund wasn't merely inconvenienced by tonight. Ryan's fund was 3 weeks from insolvency, propped up entirely by the promise of a merger that no longer existed. He'd known it for a month already, had watched 2 junior partners quietly update their resumes in the break room when they thought no one was looking, had spent 3 sleepless nights running numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times he rearranged them. The merger had been the only lifeline left, and Elizabeth Jones had just cut it in front of witnesses, which meant the documentation he'd threatened her with wasn't a bluff, which meant whatever came next wasn't going to be a phone call made in anger and regretted by morning. It was going to take him a few days to build it properly, and he intended to use every one of them. 4 days passed in a kind of fragile quiet. Neither Elizabeth nor Joseph fully trusted. He kept his shifts. Reuben clapped him on the shoulder the first morning back and said nothing, except that he'd known there was more to the professor than he let on, and left it at that, the particular tact of one working man toward another. She kept her meetings, though her assistant noticed she smiled more between them now. Small, private smiles that vanished the second anyone asked what had caused them. In the evenings they met at the community center, 2 blocks from Amanda's college, where Elizabeth had quietly arranged for Joseph to volunteer teaching piano twice a week. A favor called in from a director who owed her one and asked no questions. Amanda came along most nights too, doing homework in the corner of the rehearsal room, half listening to her father's patient instructions to a rotating cast of 9 and 10-year-olds who'd never once looked at him and seen a uniform. It was there on the 5th morning that the story broke. Ryan had been careful. He hadn't invented anything from nothing. He'd taken real numbers, a real settlement from 13 years ago, and rearranged them into a shape that made Joseph look less like a man who'd survived a cover-up and more like a man who'd engineered one. A prior claim, a prior payout, a pattern, the article called it, of a man who knew how to extract money from powerful women. It hit the financial desks 40 minutes before the markets opened and was picked up twice within the hour, reshaped, sharpened. By mid-morning, it wasn't a headline anymore. It was a narrative, and narratives, Elizabeth had learned a long time ago, move faster than facts ever managed to. She read it standing in her kitchen, in yesterday's clothes, coffee going cold in her hand, phone buzzing itself off the counter with calls from board members who'd apparently all decided this was an acceptable hour for a crisis. Her chief counsel reached her before she'd finished her first cup. The board's called an emergency session for Thursday. You need to walk in with a position. My position is that every word of that article is a lie. Your position needs to survive scrutiny if it's wrong. It's not wrong. Then prove it by Thursday. A pause waited, because right now what we have is a CEO involved with an employee who has an unexplained settlement from a company subsidiary, and a fiancé you dumped less than a week ago, accusing you of concealing material information from the board. That's not a scandal, Elizabeth. That's a resignation letter waiting to be written. Across the city, Joseph was reading the same article on Amanda's laptop at their kitchen table, and something in him had gone completely, dangerously still, the particular stillness of a man standing at the edge of something he recognized. They're calling you a con artist. Amanda's voice stayed tight. Phone in her hand scrolling comments that were getting worse by the minute. There's a whole thread calling you a gold digger. Dad, some of these people found our old address. I see it. You don't sound like you see it. You sound like you're somewhere else entirely. He was. 13 years ago, there'd been a different version of this exact morning. A settlement offer, a non-disclosure clause, a lawyer explaining in careful, patient language that fighting back would cost more than losing quietly ever would. He'd learned that lesson once already, in a conference room that smelled like new carpet, at 23 years old with his hand still wrapped in gauze. Quiet was survivable. Quiet had kept food on the table and a roof over both their heads for years since. Except quiet had also cost him every one of those years of being anyone at all. His phone rang. Elizabeth, don't come to the office this week. No greeting. Her voice stretched thin. Ryan's people are camped outside the building. If they get a photo of you walking in, it becomes the only story anyone remembers. I wasn't planning to hide. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to trust me for a few days so we can actually fix this instead of just reacting to it. Joseph's jaw tightened. I spent 13 years surviving quietly. I watched what it cost me. I'm not doing it again. A pause on the line, and when Elizabeth spoke again, her voice had dropped, softer, something almost pleading, underneath the exhaustion. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to give this a little time. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one this morning. He closed his eyes. Trust had gotten complicated for him a long time before she'd walked into his life. The last time he'd took him for with the Jones name attached to it, they'd crushed his hand and called it an acceptable cost. A few days, he said finally. A few days. She hung up first, and Joseph sat there, with the phone, still against his ear for a moment, listening to nothing. Amanda watching him from across the table, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly. Something closer to fierce. You should fight this. Her voice stayed quiet. Actually fight it. Not the quiet version. The real version. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Dad. You just haven't let yourself believe it in 13 years. At exactly the same moment, 3 floors above a downtown parking structure, Deborah White was standing in her kitchen, with her own television, tuned to a business channel, watching a photograph of Joseph Davis flash across the screen under a chyron that made her stomach turn. She'd known that face since the night of the party, and before that, distantly, from a rehearsal hall she hadn't set foot in for 13 years, retired 6 years now, from a career in structural safety compliance. She'd walked away from that division, the same quiet way everyone eventually did, after it folded. No fanfare, no exit interview worth remembering, just a box of personal effects and a severance check that came with an unspoken understanding. Except she'd kept a copy. Of course she'd kept a copy. 22 years in safety compliance teaches you that paperwork disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient for someone with more power than you, and Deborah had learned, early in her career, to photograph what mattered before it could vanish. She'd recognized Joseph Davis at the Christmas party without fully admitting it to herself, some instinct telling her to wait, to be certain, before she said anything that couldn't be unsaid. Watching him get dragged across a news chyron for a tragedy that had never once, in 13 years, been his fault, made the waiting feel like the wrong choice it had probably always been. She picked up her phone and called a number she hadn't used in 6 years. Kenneth Lee answered on the third ring, gravel-voiced, cautious. "Deborah White, didn't expect to hear from you again. I need you to get me in touch with Joseph Davis." She was already pulling a fireproof box down from her closet shelf. Before this gets any worse than it already is. By the time the board convened on Thursday morning, the boardroom on the 40th floor of Meridian Tower had filled with more tension than furniture. 9 board members, 3 lawyers, and Elizabeth, standing at the head of the table in a navy suit that felt, for the first time in her career, like armor instead of a uniform. "The documents are fraudulent." She spoke before anyone could open, with a question designed to corner her. "Every figure in that article has been altered from the original settlement record. I've requested the unredacted file from our own legal archive, which should confirm it before this meeting ends." That's convenient timing. A board member near the far end, a man named Thomas Rodriguez, who'd sat on this board longer than Elizabeth had been alive, kept his arms crossed, unconvinced. A settlement record that happens to name your family's own subsidiary in a safety failure. "Forgive me if I'm not comforted." "You shouldn't be comforted." Elizabeth stayed steady, refusing to flinch. "You should be furious, because 13 years ago, this company crushed a man's hand and his entire future, rather than absorb the cost of replacing faulty equipment, and buried it well enough that half of you are hearing about it for the first time this week." A ripple went through the room, uneasy murmured. "That's a serious allegation," Thomas said. "It's a documented fact I intend to prove before we adjourn." Elizabeth's voice didn't waver, though her hands, folded tightly in front of her, betrayed the effort it cost her. "The question in front of this board isn't whether I'm personally involved with an employee. The question is whether this company is finally willing to answer for something it should have answered for 13 years ago." Her phone buzzed against the table, once insistent. She glanced down and everything in her chest tightened at the name on the screen. Kenneth Lee. She stepped out into the hallway to take it, the boardroom door swinging shut behind her, muffling the low churn of argument already rising in her absence. "Miss Jones." Kenneth's voice stayed low, urgent. "I've got someone here who says she has the original inspection report, the real one, from before it got buried." Elizabeth's heart slammed once, hard. "Bring her up." Deborah White arrived on the 40th floor. 11 minutes later, fireproof box under one arm, expression carved from the particular calm of someone who'd made peace with a decision days ago and wasn't going to second-guess it now. She didn't wait for an introduction. "My name is Deborah White. I was the safety engineer who flagged the rigging failure risk 3 weeks before it happened." She set the box on the small side table outside the boardroom, opened it, and pulled out a folder yellowed at the edges but perfectly legible. "This is my original inspection report, marked urgent. Someone above me reclassified it to routine so the show could open on schedule. I've had it in a closet for 13 years, Because I was afraid of exactly what's been happening in the papers this week. Elizabeth's hands trembled, taking the folder. Why keep it this long and never say anything? Because the man who reclassified it ran a company I needed a paycheck from. Deborah's voice was steady, but something old and tired moved behind her eyes. I've spent 13 years telling myself that was a good enough reason. This week, watching that man's face get dragged across a news chyron for a tragedy he didn't cause, it stopped being a good enough reason. The boardroom door opened. Thomas Rodriguez stood in the frame, drawn by the commotion, eyes landing on the folder in Elizabeth's hands. What is that? The truth. Elizabeth walked back into the room with it before anyone could stop her. She laid the report flat on the polished table, every board member leaning forward at once, the room's whole temperature shifting. The findings were unambiguous: a documented safety flag, a documented downgrade, a signature at the bottom that every person in that room recognized instantly because it belonged to a man half of them had worked under for 30 years. Anthony Jones's signature. My father knew. Elizabeth's voice finally broke on the words. 16 years of careful composure giving out all at once in front of 9 strangers who controlled her professional future. He knew the equipment wasn't safe. He approved it anyway to save 3 weeks of scheduled delays. A man lost his hand and his entire career so this company could open a show on time. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Thomas sat back slowly in his chair, the fight visibly draining out of him. This changes the calculation considerably. His voice went quiet. It should. Elizabeth's eyes stayed steady. It should have changed it 13 years ago. The story turned over the following days. Not softened, not buried, but inverted. The way stories sometimes do, when the truth finally outruns the version that got there first. A reporter from one of the financial desks that run Ryan's version that first morning requested a formal interview by the end of the week, and Elizabeth agreed to it. Standing in the same lobby where the whole thing had started, the Steinway visible over her shoulder, snow still falling outside the tall windows, as if the season itself refused to let the story move on without it. You're saying the original settlement was structured to conceal a known safety violation? The reporter asked. Recorder held out between them. I'm saying my family's company crushed a man's career to save 3 weeks of scheduled delays, and then spent 13 years hoping nobody would ever ask the question you just asked me. Elizabeth didn't flinch from the camera the way she once might have. I can't undo what happened to him. I can make sure it never happens to anyone else at this company again. The corrections ran within days, and they carried more weight than the original story ever had, because this time there was a signature attached, a name, an inspection report that couldn't be argued with the way a settlement figure could be twisted. Ryan Robinson's fund collapsed by the end of that week. Not because of the story alone. His investors had been circling the exit for weeks already. The merger with Meridian Group, the only thing keeping the doors open. But the story was the final push, the public confirmation that the deal was dead, and dragging his credibility down with it. Within days, his name had been quietly scrubbed from 3 different investment newsletters that had, a week earlier, been eager to publish anything with his byline on it. He left the city not long after, and neither Joseph nor Elizabeth ever heard from him again, which struck both of them separately as the kindest ending available to a man who'd never once shown either of them any kindness of his own. Anthony Jones resigned from the board before the week was out, before the vote to remove him could even be scheduled, his lawyer issuing a statement that used the word regret exactly once, and the word responsibility not at all. He moved out of the city within the month, to a smaller house in a quieter town, and for a while Elizabeth heard nothing from him beyond the occasional forwarded piece of legal correspondence, and told herself that was probably the end of it, that some fathers simply couldn't find their way back across a distance they'd spent decades building. Joseph learned about most of it secondhand, sitting at his kitchen table, with Amanda beside him, watching the coverage shift in real time on a laptop screen, a strange, hollow feeling settling into his chest that he didn't immediately recognize as relief, because relief had never once, in 13 years, felt this disorienting. They're saying your name like it means something now. Amanda watched a reporter reference him not as the maintenance worker, but as Joseph Davis, whose career was cut short by a documented safety failure. Feels strange. Joseph exhaled. Being a person in a headline instead of a footnote, his phone rang. Elizabeth, her voice thinner than he'd ever heard it. Exhaustion and something like disbelief tangled together. It's done. Her breath caught, steadied. My father's gone. Ryan's gone. There's still a formal hearing next week, and I imagine the legal fallout runs another year at minimum. But Joseph, it's done. The lie is dead. How do you feel? A long pause on the line, and when Elizabeth spoke again, her voice had softened into something rawer, more honest than boardroom composure allowed for. Like I spent 16 years protecting a memory that was never actually as fragile as I thought it was. Like I could have said his name out loud years ago and the sky wouldn't have fallen. Which one? His voice stayed quiet. Jonathan's or mine? Both. I think I've been protecting both of you the same way. Without realizing it, keeping you both in a drawer where nothing could hurt either of you again. Joseph closed his eyes, throat tight. I'd like to stop being kept in a drawer, if it's all the same to you. Her laugh came through thin and watery and entirely real. I think that can be arranged. The formal hearing the following week ran shorter than anyone expected, largely because there was very little left to argue. Anthony's resignation was formalized. A new safety compliance division was announced, funded at 3 times its previous budget, with Deborah White brought on as an advisory consultant, a job offer she accepted on the spot, in the same boardroom where her report had finally seen daylight, 13 years after she'd first written it. Joseph was invited to speak, though nobody on the board had actually expected him to accept. He stood at the head of the same table where his settlement had once been quietly negotiated, away from him, in a room that still smelled faintly of the same expensive carpet, and found that his hands, for the first time he could remember, weren't shaking. 13 years ago, I sat in a room like this one, and let a lawyer explain to me why staying quiet was the smart choice. His voice stayed steady, unhurried. I believed him, because I was 23, and scared, and my hand didn't work anymore, and nobody had ever taught me what it looked like to fight a company this size and win. I've spent the years since mopping the floors of buildings owned by people who never once had to think twice about what happened to me. A pause, and something in his posture straightened, some old weight finally setting down. I'm not here for an apology, though I'd take one if it were offered honestly. I'm here because somewhere in this building there might be another kid with a scholarship and a talent nobody's bothered to notice yet. And I'd like it to actually matter to somebody, this time, before it costs him everything. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. Then Thomas Rodriguez, of all people, stood and extended a hand across the table. For what it's worth, Mr. Davis, it matters now. That evening, Anthony Jones did something none of them expected. He sent a letter, not an email, an actual letter, handwritten, delivered by courier to Joseph's apartment, because apparently Anthony had learned Joseph's address the same way. Everyone in this story eventually learned everything, through people who owed him nothing anymore, but told him anyway out of some lingering habit of deference. The letter was short. Joseph read it twice at the kitchen table, Amanda watching from across the room, careful not to ask. I was wrong, it read, in handwriting that had clearly started steady and lost its nerve somewhere in the second line. I told myself for 13 years it was a business decision, and I have spent this week discovering how thin that word sounds once it's finally said out loud in front of people who matter. You deserve to keep playing. Instead, I gave you a mop and called it generous. I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted you to at least hear the words from me directly, rather than through a lawyer, the way everything else in your life has apparently come to you through mine. He set the letter down slowly, something unclenching across his shoulders that had been clenched, he realized. For so long he'd forgotten it was possible for it to release. Are you okay? Amanda's voice stayed quiet. I think so. A long breath. I think for the first time in 13 years I actually am. Elizabeth found him that same night at the community center, standing in a small rehearsal room that smelled like rosin and old carpet, watching him help a 9-year-old work through a scale on an upright piano that had clearly seen better decades. She stood in the doorway, a long moment, before either of them noticed her, watching Joseph's scarred hand guide a child's smaller one across the keys, patient, unhurried, entirely present in a way she suspected the world had rarely let him be. I signed you up as a volunteer instructor without asking. She admitted it once he finally looked up. The director owed me a favor. I hope that's not presumptuous. It's the least presumptuous thing anyone's done for me in years. He smiled, small, real. Turns out I missed this more than I let myself admit. She crossed the room, sat on the piano bench beside him. Once the child had been collected by a parent waiting in the hall, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence comfortable in a way silence between them hadn't quite managed to be before. I want to start something. Elizabeth's voice finally broke the quiet. A scholarship fund for kids like you were, talented and broke, and one bad break away from disappearing entirely. I want to name it after Jonathan. A pause, careful. And after you, if you'll let me. Joseph looked at her for a long moment, something settling behind his eyes that looked almost like peace. Jonathan would have liked that. He always said talent that nobody sees is the loneliest thing in the world. He sounds like he understood you better than you gave him credit for. He did. A small, sad smile. I think that's part of why it took me this long, to let anyone else understand me the same way. Elizabeth reached over and took his scarred hand in both of hers, the way she had once before in a different lobby, except this time, there was nothing left buried underneath it. No secret, no debt, no grief pretending to be composure. Just two people who'd spent a combined 30 years protecting the wrong things at the wrong cost, finally choosing, deliberately, to protect each other instead. Play something. Her voice softened. Something that isn't a ghost's, something that's actually yours. Joseph turned back to the piano, flexed his scarred hand once against his knee, and began to play, hesitant at first, then surer, a melody with no history behind it yet, built entirely from scratch, imperfect and searching, and completely his own. Elizabeth closed her eyes and listened, and somewhere in the unfinished, uncertain shape of it, she heard something she hadn't heard in 16 years, a promise being made in real time, instead of one being grieved. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way it always did in that city. And, by the time the first real thaw arrived, the scholarship fund had already sent its first 3 students to summer programs neither of their families could otherwise have afforded. Amanda finished her spring semester with the highest marks of her college career so far, framed her chemistry final, and hung it on the refrigerator, half as a joke and half because some part of her wanted her father to see, every morning, exactly what all those break room hours had built. Deborah White settled into her new consulting role with the particular satisfaction of a woman who'd waited 13 years to matter to the people who'd once decided. Her work didn't. She and Joseph developed an easy friendship over the following months, born mostly of long conversations in the community center kitchen about buildings, about safety, about the particular ache of knowing something true for years, before anyone was ready to hear it. Kenneth Lee retired from the security desk that spring, and Joseph and Amanda were the ones who organized his small farewell gathering, because family, it turned out, could be built from more than blood, and Kenneth had earned a place in theirs a long time, before either of them said so out loud. Anthony Jones reached out again in early summer, tentative, a phone call this time, instead of a letter, asking whether he might attend the community center's spring recital, sitting quietly in the back row, where nobody would recognize him. Elizabeth said yes, before she'd fully decided to forgive him. Because some reconciliations start that way, an invitation extended before the feeling behind it has caught up. Spring came slower to the city than it did anywhere else, but it came. The community center had a waiting list for the first time in its history. By the time the annual charity concert rolled around, and Joseph stood backstage, that evening in a plain black suit, Amanda beside him in a dress she'd bought with her own money for once, teasing him about his tie, the way she'd been teasing him about everything since the day her ankle healed and never fully stopped. "You're not nervous," she said, watching his hands. They weren't shaking. Not anymore. He walked out under the lights to a room full of people who no longer saw a uniform or a badge or a service entrance. Only a man about to play. Elizabeth watched from the wings, the way she always did now, not performing composure for anyone. Just there, just steady, just certain in a way that had taken both of them the better part of a year to earn honestly. Deborah sat near the front with Kenneth, saved him the seat beside her, the way old colleagues do without needing to discuss it. In the back row, quiet, uncertain of his welcome, but present anyway, sat Anthony Jones, hands folded in his lap, watching a man he'd once called mediocre, prepare to play for a room that had finally learned better. He sat down at the piano and let his hands find the keys, and what came out was neither Jonathan's 8 bars nor the ghost of a boy who'd once been too afraid to sign his own name to anything. It was something new, built on top of the old grief the way spring gets built on top of winter, not erasing it, just finally giving it somewhere warmer to stand. When the last note faded, the applause rose slow, and then all at once, and Joseph found Elizabeth's eyes across the room and understood, for the first time in more years than he cared to count, that some promises don't end when the person who asked for them is gone. They just wait, patiently, for someone brave enough to finish writing them.